We're going to roll right into the next panel here, which is going to focus on intervention. The title of the session that we've given it is Resetting the Bar: Where, How, and Why America Should Not, in parentheses, Intervene Abroad. And so we'll focus most of this conversation on this big question, which is animating a lot of the discussion about what our grand strategy should look like in general, about where should America intervene, under what circumstances, when, why, et cetera. But we'll touch a few questions on sort of broader grand strategy first. And we have this great group to talk about these things. To my immediate left is Rebecca Friedman Lissner, who is the Associate Professor in the Strategic and Operational Research Department at the U.S. Naval War College. Then we have Vance Serchuk, who is an Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Center for New American Security, and Josh Shifrinson, Assistant Professor of International Relations at Boston University. Rebecca and Josh have essays in our compilation here that have two different perspectives on grand strategy. Vance doesn't have an essay in here, but he does have an op-ed in the Washington Post that came out yesterday, which I would commend to all of you, arguing that the issue is not just that in this renewed era of great power competition, we are outgunned by Russia and China, but we're actually being outsmarted by Russia and China. And so a little thinking goes a long way. So that's a nice way of starting this off. As I said, I want to get into the specific question of intervention in a couple of minutes, but I wanted to start by kind of zooming out about grand strategy and America's role in the world, and start with, before we get to the prescriptions, the diagnosis of sort of where we are. I was in Kansas City a couple of days ago, and we were at the University of Missouri at Kansas City, and the students there expressed this view that they are likely to spend the rest of their lives in a world where America is not the number one, America is the number two. And we did an event at CNAS a few weeks ago, and Andy Krepanevich, who was at CSBA, now he's an adjunct fellow with us, and he was involved in the National Defense Strategy Commission, made an intriguing point. He said that since 1885, the United States has never faced a competitor or a group of competitors with a GDP greater than 40% of our own. And China's now closing in at 100%, depending on how you measure, PPP or whatever, you know, it's over, or, you know, anyway, it will be above ours at some point. So in the world where we have a generation presuming as a fact that we're going to be number two rather than number one, where China's closing in on our GDP, how do you see America's relative power position? Or is it sort of, you know, are we all declinists now? Or should we pursue a grand strategy based on the premise that, you know, through hard work and good old American stick-to-itiveness, we can remain on top forever? So, Becca.
Sure, great. Well, thanks, Richard, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm really excited to be part of an important conversation because particularly now I think that we can talk about grand strategy in a way that perhaps hasn't been possible for much of the post-Cold War period, because it feels like a lot more is actually up for grabs now. And so that's why we need an injection, I think, of new ideas and new voices, and why events like this are so important. To Richard's specific question, no, I don't think that we're all declinists, although of course it depends whether you define that in absolute or relative terms. In relative terms, of course, the rise of China means that as a share of total global power, the United States has diminished. But I think to focus too much on that is to ignore the still very advantageous position that the United States is in now and will continue to find itself in over the next 10 to 15 years. So yes, you know, China is rising, even as it does face some pretty formidable demographic and economic challenges internally. I think, you know, Russia is clearly revanchist. It's armed with nuclear weapons, but we would be remiss to not acknowledge the profound weaknesses endemic in the sort of Russian bases of national power, particularly demographically and economically. So they certainly don't belong in the same category as China. So what we see internationally is a world in which international outcomes are more contested, in which the exercise of American power will surely be more constrained, but where I think the United States will nevertheless remain the world's most powerful nation. So as we look forward and try to craft a grand strategy, I think we need to keep that very much in mind, that this isn't a world where the United States needs to wholly retrench because it can't possibly sustain its position. It's more about how do we put our grand strategy on more sustainable footing in view of the fact that international politics will be more contested, that our options will be more constrained, but that we are by no means resigned to just packing up our troops and heading home.
And so just to be clear, so as a relative, so we'll define this as a relative power position, because absolute, lots of countries are growing in power, but as the United States can stay number one, the strongest country in the world indefinitely, given the right sets of policies and right grand strategy.
Again, it sort of depends along what metric, but certainly if you look at the U.S. together with its admittedly sluggish but still very capable allies, the cluster of power that represents, China is unlikely to overtake in the foreseeable future.
Josh, how about you on this? And also, I think embedded in Rebecca's answer is an interesting point, which is the most meaningful metric here may not be how powerful is the United States in the abstract and absolutely or relatively, but and China, but rather the United States plus its allies and partners around the world versus China and its allies and partners around the world, which is to say North Korea and Cambodia on a good day. So what is your take both on this sort of previous question, but also the way that I think Rebecca is framing that, you know, it's a little more complicated than just looking at the U.S. versus China.
Right. Isn't it just the U.S. and friend versus China, right? So there are two questions on the table. One is the U.S. in relative decline? What does this mean? The second question is, how do we assess the distribution of power and what this means for American grand strategy? If we're saying China's rising, then we're all declinists. To say that is just to acknowledge the distribution of power, which is something that realism or realists have long advocated for. So all of you, welcome to the tribe. So that's point number one. Point number two, therefore, is what do you do about it? Here, I would agree with Rebecca that the U.S. doesn't need to wholly retrench, but in a world where there are peer competitors that can do a humdinger and really cause problems for the U.S. ability to exert itself in international affairs, it's not just a matter of being more constrained and seeing outcomes more contested. It means the margin for screwing up, the margin for error is far lower. I'm from New Jersey, so I occasionally lapse into euphemisms. So I'll just call it the margin for screwing up comes into play. So that's not an insult to the state of New Jersey. Please don't take my card. So what does this mean? This means that we have to think about a world in which when the U.S. decides to intervene or decides to exert itself internationally, we got to be darn certain it's in our national interest, that there's no other actor that wants to bear the risks of tilting with potential peer competitors. It's a situation where the question isn't just, is it in the U.S. interest, but also how much risk does the U.S. want to bear for this value added? And in my estimation, there are significant parts of the world where the U.S. can pull back, or where the U.S. can do a significantly less active role in international security affairs, and along the way may even benefit economically, strategically, and politically. Is the question what the U.S. can do to maintain its position? Look, the U.S. has a large economy, has nuclear weapons, has a great demographic position, as was mentioned. It's geographically in a wonderful neck of the woods. This is a world where the U.S. doesn't have to worry about being number one, because at the end of the day, being number two will still be an awesome place to be. I'm less worried about the shift in the distribution of power and more about what it means for American national security. And there I look at the world and I go, heck, we're pretty good. We're pretty good.
Vance, is it awesome if the United States is number two and an illiberal China that seeks to alter rules is number one, or not?
Well, first, Richard, thanks so much for having me and for this discussion. I guess the starting point for me is that I'm not really a big fan of the kind of the BuzzFeed school of like, here are the top 10 powers on the planet. Number 4 will shock you. So when we think about what power is exactly, I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that over the last 10 years, the United States has not done well in the head-to-head confrontations it's had with China and Russia. If you look at what's played out in Syria, where we have tussled with Russia, where we had a declared goal initially, which was the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, Vladimir Putin decided that that was going to be something that he would thwart, and he succeeded in thwarting us. In the South China Sea, the United States, by any kind of raw military power terms, for 10 years ago, was in a very strong position in the South China Sea, particularly when you then couple it with Japan, with other allies that we can bring to bear. Nonetheless, the Chinese succeeded in achieving their declared aim in the South China Sea, which was building up these militarized artificial islands over the express objections of the United States and our allies. Point of this is to say it's not just a question of go down the roster and say, well, who has more submarines and who has more raw military capability? All that's important, even economics as well. But when you look at the success of a country like Russia in particular, which is by any measure so much weaker, but nonetheless Putin has been quite effective in recent years in being able to arguably run circles around us, it goes to show that there's this other quality, right? Which is this thing which, for lack of a better term, is called statecraft. It's actually developing strategies, trying to determine like what your ends and means are, integrating diplomatic and military tactics, having operational concepts. And so to me, when we sort of look back at what has gone wrong, and I think that we can and should have a long conversation about things that have not gone well in the last 10, 15 years, it actually comes back in many cases much more to how we've used the instruments of our power and less about these sort of abstract questions of, well, the totality of our power. I mean, in the most explicit terms, the United States went up against an insurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 15 years. The results have not been good for us. It hasn't been because our economy is smaller than that of the guys we've been fighting, or because we're less technologically savvy. It's that they actually have developed much more innovative and I mean diabolically so, but innovative approaches to thwarting the projection of American power. And so I think that that's probably where the conversation should probably begin.
All right. Well, that's a good segue into this question about intervention that I want to get to. And to do that, I want to quote actually a very pithy sentence from Rebecca's essay. She says, the United States military intervened abroad to stem civil strife in Somalia, promote democracy in Haiti, stop ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Kosovo, preempt an illusory WMD program in Iraq, retaliate against the al-Qaeda harboring Taliban in Afghanistan, prevent a humanitarian emergency in Libya, defeat the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and fight the scourge of terrorism around the world. And in that sentence, I think she really encapsulates a couple things. One, the volume of military interventions the United States has undertaken in the post-Cold War period, and two, the diversity of stated reasons or objectives for these. So, Rebecca, let me ask you, I took from your essay that you think that's just too much, and this is a distraction from other more important items on the sort of grand strategy agenda. Let's leave Iraq out of the question, because I think that there's a growing or near consensus that war was a mistake, and we can get into that, but it has a way of sort of bending all of the light around its gravitational pull. But if you look at the other reasons and interventions, is your sort of take that all of this kind of stuff is we shouldn't have done it? And if we shouldn't have, how much of this is we shouldn't have done it under any circumstances and we just didn't do it as well as you would have hoped we would have done it?
Yeah, so what I think is really interesting looking back at the post-Cold War period and all of those interventions that you just enumerated is, particularly if we're accepting Iraq, how low cost, particularly in sort of American lives, perhaps setting aside the lives of the people in the places where we intervened, and also low risk, all of those interventions really were. And what I think that did was just create a tremendously permissive condition, not only for the U.S. to, on a discretionary basis, undertake what Richard Haas, I think, very aptly called these wars of choice alongside other wars of necessity, but also enabled a pretty pernicious mission creep. So if you think about the war in Afghanistan, for example, clearly, that is one that I think we ought to have pursued in response to the 9/11 attacks. But I can't exactly explain why we're still there now, right? That's clearly not justifiable on the same bases. And so in looking back, I do think it's important to do an inventory of these post-Cold War interventions. To them, we could also add a number of Cold War interventions that in many ways suffered from similar pathologies. But in addition to looking at these discrete choices, my essay also argues, and I think it's important, to examine the strategic conditions that enable them. And as we look to the future, to understand how those conditions may actually be changing in ways that are meaningful, not only for military intervention, but also for grand strategy more broadly. And so what I think that means is, first of all, acknowledging that for most of the post-Cold War period, we did not have these formidable great power competitors that we were just talking about. And basically what that allowed the United States to do was pursue this grand strategy of liberal internationalism that was sort of universalizing in its ambitions, right? There were a few natural limits to where democracy was supposed to spread or where human rights could potentially be advanced. And it allowed the United States to pursue those liberal ends in the absence of any major repercussions, right? Because there was very little risk that any of the interventions that Richard enumerated or that I enumerate in my essay were going to lead to any kind of major escalation, right? Because we weren't coming up against any great power competitors who could pose a real threat to the American homeland. And until recently, we didn't even really have to worry that much about encountering counter pressure at those specific junctures. So yes, Pakistan, Iran, they exacted a lot of lethal costs on American interventions in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. But it really wasn't until the Syria intervention that we saw, as Vance was just saying, what it would look like to intervene in a place where actually another near-peer competitor was starting to push back on us in ways that began to resemble the Cold War type structure. And so that is the world that we're moving towards, right? It's one in which the U.S. cannot just decide to intervene anywhere and do so at very little, with very little fear of encountering Russia or China on the battlefield. It's a world where we need to take into account the possibility that actually even intervening on the strategic periphery, we can create situations where formidable escalation risks actually do exist and where the costs are going to be much greater because of the presence of these great power competitors. And to that, I would just add that another important frame, I think, as we look to the future and not just to the past, is that the United States has had actually the luxury of choosing where to intervene and being able to do so in a fairly propitious manner in the post-Cold War period. What we're looking at now with the advent of much greater competition, particularly with these great power rivals, is the possibility that we might have to undertake intervention decisions on behalf of our allies in areas that are actually quite proximate to Russia, to China. You could think about, a Baltic contingency. You could think about a Taiwan contingency. And there, I'm not sure that these are actually wars of choice. They might actually be wars of necessity, but we need to look that problem in the face and understand that future intervention decisions aren't going to be so luxurious, so low cost, at least in comparative terms, but actually they might be highly risky, highly escalatory, and we need to begin to plan for those as well.
And that's a really interesting point that, if we say, let's not do the kind of interventions we did in the past because we're in a world of great power competition in which we have to focus on China and Russia, at least if the lesson of the Cold War is any, then we will get into different kinds of interventions, but we won't get into no interventions.
That's right.
We'll get into proxy wars, we'll get into interventions potentially on the periphery of spheres of influence and things like that. Vance, let me come back, though, to the sort of list that I enumerated. And it's relatively straightforward to quantify the costs of these kinds of interventions, the lives lost, or the casualties, the dollars spent, the opportunity costs that these kind of interventions imposed on our foreign policy. It's harder to weigh up the benefits. So there wasn't another 9/11, although everyone expected that after 9/11. We did stop genocide in Europe based on the intervention in the Balkans. ISIS in Syria and Iraq, which was plotting attacks against the United States and inspiring them at home and in our allies, did lose its caliphate. So how do you account for the benefits of these things and sort of weigh them up against the costs? Or are we in danger of sort of gravitating toward one side when we're in one mood and one side when we're in another?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the precisely the data points that you raised, Richard, are really important ones because I think that the dominant sentiment right now is very much that, look, we look back on the last 25 years and really hasn't it all just been a horrible, pointless mess? I think there's no question when you look particularly at some of the horrible mistakes that were made in Iraq, many, many mistakes made in Afghanistan. These are things that it's, I think, impossible to sit here and try to justify. What I think is equally striking, though, is that when you step back and say, look, after 9/11, the basis for our interventions was we do not want another catastrophic attack on American soil. Right? The fact that there has not been another catastrophic attack on American soil has not been for lack of trying by Al-Qaeda and by ISIS. The forward presence that we have sustained in a variety of different forms. And I think one of the other challenges with the entire discussion about military intervention is that it does end up comparing very, very different things. Right? So there is Iraq, which, Richard, as you say, kind of is it's a mass where the gravitational weight of it bends everything else around it. But then you look at the nature of the interventions that we have mostly done in recent years, geared towards counterterrorism, where it has been relatively small numbers of U.S. forces working with local partners with a very small cost in U.S. life. Any cost, obviously, in U.S. life is terrible. But by any historical standard, very small numbers of U.S. casualties, extraordinarily precise use of firepower, extraordinary attention being given to try to prevent civilian casualties, and to only target those people who we can say, but with extraordinarily high standard by, again, any historical standard, are people who are trying to do harm to the United States or to our allies. And the net effect is that we live in a world where there hasn't been a catastrophic attack. We'd be having a very different conversation today if, in 2006, multiple airlines had gone down over the Atlantic as Al-Qaeda attempted. We'd be having a very different conversation if Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula had succeeded in some of its plots, which we know of, to carry out attacks in the U.S. homeland. Likewise, we look at the situation in Europe today, the success that we did achieve in the Balkans. The Balkans are by no means at the end of history. But in comparison to what was there in 1994, 1995, when the genocide was taking place, conversely, it is worth, I think, taking a moment and thinking about the data points that we have for non-intervention during this period. Let's be also very explicit about that. We're noting the 25th anniversary of Rwanda right now. 800,000 people murdered in a matter of weeks. It's a choice not to intervene, to take a step back. Syria, even more dramatically, is a case study in what a world of non-intervention looks like, where the United States made the decision that we were not going to lean in, but rather we're going to lean back. And on the question of when you intervene and when you don't, one of my youthful indiscretions, one of many, was that I went to law school. And I recall one of my professors saying, in response to a particular case, sure, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? The challenge is we all want to try to find the perfect formula, the perfect doctrine. Intervention ultimately turns on a thing called judgment. It's the judgment of the leaders whom we elect. When we fall into, I think, rigid formula for saying, aha, this is this, we're only going to apply this particular formula, therefore we're going to do this, that's when we get into trouble. It requires ultimately a much more nuanced calculation, which can't ultimately be redacted to any one thing. At the beginning of Syria, I think that a lot of people looked at Syria in the Obama administration through the prism of Iraq. That turned out to be wrong, I think, in a number of different ways. 2003, I think a lot of people in the Bush administration looked at Iraq through the prism of the interventions in the 1990s, which seemed to go reasonably well and were successful. That also was wrong. So I wish I could come here offering that simple formula, but I don't think it exists.
Josh, let me turn to you and ask to pick up on what Vance said, both on the benefits that he identified from, no second 9/11 and things like that, stopping genocide in Europe. From some of these interventions, would you sort of weigh up the benefits in the same way? Do you think that they were still sort of insufficient to merit intervention? And then also on this question of non-intervention, Rwanda, Darfur, Syria, in retrospect, do we wish we had done something where we did nothing?
I was listening to Vance speak, and I was wondering if we were actually looking at the same set of data. Because I'm looking at Afghanistan, and I'm saying that since 2001, 2002, this has not been an anti-Al-Qaeda operation. It's been an anti-Taliban operation, which were not the perpetrators of 9/11, we should recall. Likewise, as you said, Syria was about anti-Assad, which is not the same thing as fighting ISIS. And ISIS, we should recall, was born of an American intervention in Iraq. I know that's the thing that shall not be named in this conversation, but it's worth pointing out that the intervention begot more problems for the United States. So I'm listening to the conversation about the virtues of these interventions and going, look, these military interventions at the higher level have little or nothing to do with U.S. interests. In some case, the bigger ones actually harmed U.S. interests. Now, the question becomes, under what conditions does the U.S. want to intervene? How do we stop another 9/11, which I think we all agree is a good thing to do. In this situation, though, it's an intelligence and a covert action operation. It's not a military intervention like Iraq or Afghanistan or the Balkan operation. This is a different set of scales. This is a different issue. We're comparing apples and bowling balls here, and I think the history is a little bit off here. As for the question of non-intervention, look, it would be lovely to stop genocide. I'm in favor of intervening to stop genocide. I am. But as we know from Alan Cooperman's work, it's awfully hard to get to some of these places in the first instance. The military options are indeed limited, point number one. Point number two, there are legitimate political difficulties involved. And lastly, I think we should lift the scales from our eyes here. International politics is a brutish world. Bad things do happen. And if our standard for intervention is stop anything bad happening anywhere, this is a recipe for imperial overstretch and intellectual exhaustion amongst the DC elite.
Can I say one more thing on this point?
Yeah, and Josh, you're being very unclear. No, I'm just kidding. But can I just go back to Josh, and then let me come to you. So I think you're very clear on your reading of the data, as was Vance. But just to go back to a couple of the specifics, because I think it is worth tying this to specific examples to think about what sort of rises above the threshold and what does not. So if we applied the sort of principles or lessons that you just enumerated, so would that have meant no American military intervention in the Balkans, no American military intervention against the Taliban, which was harboring Al-Qaeda? We would just have done sort of intel and special ops to go after Al-Qaeda. No military intervention, Rwanda, Darfur, Syria, no military intervention. Is that, I'm trying to get at what it is that you think is sort of a legitimate military intervention and what you think is unwise.
So I'm going to avoid using the phrase legitimate, just use
academic. Okay.
Yeah, no, it's because
wise or unwise?
Sure. I mean,
what stuff we should do versus stuff we should not.
So look, there was an obvious need to go in after 9/11 and take care, respond in some way, right? The point is the intervention that has existed since about 2002 has been a state-building operation, which is not the same thing as saying let's kick down Al-Qaeda and try to eliminate the conditions that fostered 9/11. So my point there is simply that much of the intervention wasn't about the initial impetus, wasn't for a vital American interest. The interest was stop another 9/11, which once you've kicked the situation that allowed Al-Qaeda to flourish out of the equation, it becomes less of a state. The need for a permanent, more or less permanent, now 20 years, American presence goes way, way down. As for the question of where does the U.S. intervene going forward, look, I think the Balkans, there was a rationale for trying to stop the operation. But let's remember, U.S. troops and U.S. presence is still there 20 years later. This is not a short-term operation. I think likewise when it comes to Darfur and Rwanda, yes, the impetus to intervene should be there. The U.S. should be trying to stop genocide. I just think we should not be holding ourselves to such a standard that it becomes any genocide anywhere, any humanitarian crisis anywhere becomes a vital interest to be acted against, nor should we hold ourselves or expect ourselves to have a perfect success rate. I don't think it's fair to say because X, Y, Z occurred, American intervention was necessary. I think that's a interesting and I think fundamentally flawed interpretation of the American role in the world.
Rebecca.
I just wanted to get back to the Iraq piece of all this because I think it's all well and good to bracket that, but especially as a grand strategic matter, we really have to look the Iraq example squarely in the face. And by that I mean what we're really debating here about military interventions in the context of grand strategy is how much of these military interventions, to include the intervention in Iraq, flowed necessarily from the United States post-Cold War grand strategy, which in the compendium of essays, different people define what that grand strategy was in different ways. I actually think it's overly simplifying in many cases. So I will call that grand strategy liberal internationalism. So was Iraq an inevitable outgrowth of liberal internationalism? If so, then when we're doing the sort of pro-con ledger about whether this is a grand strategy that either retrospectively was successful or prospectively should continue, I mean, Iraq is a pretty good mark on the con side of things. However, I think you could make a very defensible argument that Iraq was not the inevitable outgrowth of liberal internationalism, and that if Al Gore had won the election, by virtue of a slightly different Supreme Court decision, maybe we don't end up there. And so maybe that was much more of a historically contingent accident than not. But we do have to reckon with the Iraq case, I think, in the sort of broader context of this conversation, because it has really important implications for what our grand strategic prescription should be.
And to be clear, you can talk all about Iraq all you want. My only reason to bracket was so that we didn't get pulled into everyone saying what a bad idea it was, because I think we probably all agreed
totally.
to that. But actually to talk about some of the cases that we talk about much less,
right.
Which is all these other ones.
Right, so what are the implications of that agreement?
I'm going to ask one more question, then go to the audience and be thinking of your brilliant questions so that we can go to there in a minute. I want to get back to an assumption that I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, is built into both Rebecca and Josh's takes, which is our local, well, a couple of things. One reason why the United States should be wary or should do less intervention is because we should expect the local partners to step up more. After all, our partners in Europe and in Asia and the Middle East have more acute security interests often than the United States does in whatever the thing is that we're talking about, whatever threat it is. They should take more responsibility for their own security. We should be less involved. We should be less of the crutch so that they actually take matters into their own hands, reduce the cost to us, reduce the risk to us. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's built in. And of course, this is logical, right? I mean, why should the United States have to go to Syria to stop something that's sending hundreds of thousands of refugees into Europe to destabilize Europe rather than Europe doing it itself? What I want to ask, though, is if we move from theory to the world, do we have evidence that that works? Because, of course, we didn't do anything in Syria as hundreds of thousands of refugees destabilized the politics of Europe. They weren't coming to the United States, but Europe didn't do anything. Europe didn't take matters into its own hands, even though it had a much more acute security threat and had the capabilities to do something. It did nothing. And even today, even though ISIS was plotting attacks against France when it wasn't plotting attacks against the United States, the only reason why Europeans will stay in Syria is if the United States stays. They won't stay on their own. Similarly, in the Balkans, there was the famous line from the French at the time, well, there's a European problem in the European backyard, you Americans stay out. Well, of course, then we watched the place burn until the United States got involved and had to put an end to it together with our European partners. But in the absence of the United States, nothing happened. And then if you look in the Middle East, we've sort of encouraged the Saudis to, step up, do more, take on more burdens, take matters in your own hands, and we get Yemen. So is there a case to be made that often the locals, for all the logic of the theory, either don't step up, or when they do it in ways that are fundamentally antagonistic to our own interests? And does that then undermine the case for sort of a benign withdrawal of this? Josh, does that undermine the case for allowing our partners to take on their fair share and do the work for us or for themselves?
I think you gave away the answer when you mentioned about the interest in the ways in which they intervene in undercutting American interests. I think that's the crux of the problem. I think many of the partner nations that we've been discussing do indeed seek to intervene or react in ways. They just do so in ways that we don't see as amenable to our interests. So it's a question of how much control or influence over the outcome the U.S. seeks. I think I'm very comfortable saying that in the 1990s, the European partners were indeed intervening in the Balkans. They were just not intervening in ways that the U.S. liked to see. We didn't want to see the Germans backing their Croats, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We wanted a certain resolution for Bosnia-Herzegovina and beyond. Likewise, with Syria, it was a terrible thing. It is a terrible thing to watch the destruction of Syria, but the U.S. was oscillating between two different impeti in the country, either they're attacking ISIS or backing Assad, that actually contributed to much of the problem. It's a question of the conditions and the ideas driving the way in which the U.S. intervened. A perfectly amenable solution, if you wanted to end the Syrian catastrophe, was to support Assad, to keep Assad in power, which is something many of the Europeans were okay with. So I think it's worth pointing out that it's not a question of, well, if the U.S. doesn't act, will partner countries act? The question, they absolutely will. The question is the U.S. willing to surrender the degree of control or give up the degree of control over the outcomes? And there, I'm comfortable going that given the costs involved, yes, I'm okay with that. But it's a legitimate debate to have.
Rebecca?
So that wasn't really one of the points that I make in the essay,
Okay.
and I think
that's why I'm asking you to correct me if
yeah,
I was wrong.
So
I'm
again,
wrong. So
no, that's
correct.
okay. But again, to kind of put the broader grand strategy debate and to place this in context, I think Emma's point on the earlier panel was really well taken. That there are many shades of retrenchment and restraint, and that I think that we do a disservice to the debate when we don't acknowledge that not everyone on that side agrees. So too, on the more kind of activist engagement, internationalist side of the grand strategy debate, there are important shades of difference. And I think there are sort of two key points of departure where different people take different views. So one is on the question of liberal military interventions, where I think I've put down a marker as being much more of a critic, but there are certainly people out there, perhaps Vance among them, who would actually defend a far larger subset of those liberal military interventions and the need to do them in the future. The second kind of key point of departure for people on the engagement side of the ledger is on this question of alliances. And here, I personally see America's alliances as a tremendous source of strength, particularly in the context of this sort of renewed great power competition, and also an important check on nuclear proliferation, which I do think is a pretty vital American interest. So in that sense, I very much think that we should maintain our alliances, but that's completely compatible with saying that we should also ask our allies to do more, which has been, a constant trope across bipartisan administrations for quite a long time, dating back to the Cold War to the present. And also that we should think about modernizing our alliances. Many of the places that Vance talked about us sort of falling behind Russia and China were sort of located in the broadly construed gray zone, right? And this is a place where I think our allies can, even as they continue to resist sort of ever more defense spending, and when they do defense spending, tend to not do it in the ways that we want them to. But this is somewhere where our allies, I think, can help in ways that are more palatable to them and to their publics. So, for example, there was just an article in the Wall Street Journal this week about sort of a small U.S. technical team that went to Myanmar to try to help them evaluate a Chinese Belt and Road deal. There's no reason why that has to be a United States initiative. If we're looking at how to compete with China in the sort of economic statecraft domain, that's an obvious place where our European partners or our Asian partners can be out there advancing mutual interests in ways that are not necessarily military. So too, as we think about sort of technological competition, our allies have extremely advanced economies with highly developed tech sectors. Why can't our allies be at the forefront in helping the United States sort of maintain its technological edge, develop AI, think about those applications in the national security space, all of that kind of thing. So I think these are places where we can look at our allies, acknowledge some of their inherent limitations, even as we push them to do more, but also really try to find ways that we can leverage them, taking into account the sort of new shape of conflict. Because another point that I conclude with in my essay is that we do ourselves a disservice by thinking about the future of intervention in conventional military terms. Because actually, as we've seen, there's a way in which conflict doesn't look the way that it used to and is tending to transpire much more below the traditional conventional conflict threshold. So as we're competing in that space, the sub-conventional space, I think that's somewhere where even without huge defense investments, our allies can actually do a lot more to help us win.
Vance, I want to come to you, but I want to add one question that flows from what Rebecca just had to say. So there's, I think, also a consensus that we all want our allies to do more, and then people will define differently what exactly that means. But 2% of GDP on defense spending for NATO allies has now become totemic, and we want our allies to do more burden sharing. But there's two different ways about that we might be able to affect that. One theory is if we do less, the allies will do more, because after all, these are their interests in their neighborhood and their security, and they will have to do more in order to fill the vacuum of less U.S. protection leadership activity. The other is if we do more, they will do more, because they have to be led there. And in the absence of U.S. leadership, they won't actually deploy the troops, get involved in the intervention, spend more on defense, whatever it is. So which one of those is right? And then maybe you can address this question that's been on the table before we got to that. No?
Yeah, so I think the answer is neither, right? Countries are going to make decisions based on how much they're going to spend and how they're going to behave based on their threat perception, which is why no matter how many times in the 2000s or the 1990s you could go to Germany or other parts of Europe and say, you guys need to spend more on defense and you need to really start getting serious about this, and they would shrug because they'd look around and say, okay, well, but what's the threat? Whereas after 2014, lo and behold, actually Europeans have actually been spending more on defense. Japan, which has begun to spend more on defense starting in 2013, largely driven by its own threat perception, looking across and saying, okay, well, China keeps rising, and whatever else we know, the idea of being in a Chinese-dominated Asia where we are subjugated to a kind of Chinese hegemony is unacceptable to us. Therefore, we're going to have to make some different decisions. Likewise, I think the Saudis and the Emiratis and some of their decisions have flown from a threat perception about their surroundings. If the U.S. says we're going to do more, we do more with us. That sometimes might work. If the U.S. does less, well, maybe they're going to step up more. That can also work. I think, though, one of the predicates of this conversation is this idea that we need to be injecting new ideas into the mix, and that the concepts and the theories that have animated us for the last quarter century feel increasingly tired and unsuccessful and even to some degree irrelevant. It's striking to me in that context that the whole notion of getting our allies to do more by us pulling back is something which has actually swirled in the ether and has actually been repeatedly tried, and it's never worked particularly well. In fact, it's generally and pretty consistently led to bad outcomes whenever we've given it a shot. In the most micro sense, you look at what actually did play out on a granular level in Iraq during the worst years there, which was at the absolute center of the Bush administration's approach to the Iraq War. The Iraqis are going to stand up, we're going to step back. It was the Don Rumsfeld theory of, they need to learn how to pull up their socks. And if we actually try to provide security in Iraq, the Iraqis are going to then become dependent on us and will never leave. That actually created the very conditions that intensified the Iraqi civil war. The only thing which ultimately stabilized Iraq was when we reversed that during the surge and said, well, actually, the United States is going to step up and try to provide some basic degree of security, which then actually did set the conditions for what would have been a more responsible withdrawal. Unfortunately, that got taken in a different direction. So I would argue, Richard, that, I think that the point that you alluded to, which is that when the United States has pulled back and run the experiment of what does it look like when our allies are basically told, step up and do more, the results have actually been tremendously destabilizing. So I don't think that there's actually anything remotely new about it. I think it's been tried, and I think it's been unsuccessful.
Josh, I saw you shaking your head throughout Vance's remarks here, so I think you probably have a different opinion.
I think of one of Vance's youthful indiscretions going to law school. One of mine was reading diplomatic history. So what I mean by that is it's indeed the case that allies need a threat perception to do anything in security affairs, but it's also fundamentally wrong to say that when the U.S. pulls back, allies don't do more. This was indeed the heyday of the 1960s and 1970s, when at the height of the Cold War, when the U.S. was faced with economic problems at home and obligations to Vietnam elsewhere, and then a drawdown post-Vietnam, the U.S. famously pulled back from Europe and Asia. And lo and behold, what happened? This is the one period in post-war history when the European allies significantly increased military expenditures, devoted extra divisions and extra air forces to the continent of Europe. And then in East Asia, this is the period of time when Japan decided to begin its slow process of developing a navy, famously agreeing to patrol the sea lines of communication, the SLOCs, out to 1,000 kilometers. So I would actually push back very strongly on this notion that the U.S. drawing down doesn't lead to allies stepping up. Indeed, we have a decisive test that says at a time when it looks like American decline might be real and other allies face threats to their security, allies step up. But you need, I agree with you on this one, you need the allies to have this fundamental sense of threat to get them there.
All right, let's go to the audience. There's mics floating around, so just raise your hand. Yes, sir, over here.
Hi, I'm Chris Preble from the Cato Institute. I've heard it said a couple times already today that the United States did not intervene in Syria. I would like a little clarification on that. The United States did intervene in Syria. I guess the question is to you, Vance. we did intervene in Syria. In fact, we had different agencies within the same U.S. government intervening on different sides in a civil war. So is it your argument that we just should have intervened more heavily with more personnel? Is that what you're calling for?
Well, we obviously intervened massively in the case of ISIS. In the case of what happened prior to ISIS, I would argue that we intervened spectacularly ineffectively with limited resources that were applied in an incredibly ill-thought-through way. So, Chris, where I suspect you and I would agree is that we're both against ill-thought-through intervention, irrespective of the level of resourcing that's associated with it. I'm not in favor of using resources in intervention if they're used ineffectively and thoughtfully, and that's what I think we did in Syria prior to ISIS, which is the worst of all worlds.
All right. Other questions? No one raised their hand. I'm going to start asking, which nobody wants. Yes, sir, right here.
Hi, Reed Smith with the Charles Koch Institute. In 2011, when the United States and its NATO partners intervened in Libya, R2P was a norm in cascade. Where does the panel see R2P and its validity in present-day terms?
Someone want to take that one on? Rebecca?
Sure, I'm happy to take that. I think that R2P was an ill-advised norm. It was one that, again, was sort of enabled by a certain context in which liberalism did seem to be on the march, and there were a few counter pressures to that. But going forward, I think if we're trying to think about what are the principles for a future international order, and therefore what principles should the United States advance, that will be at least minimally tolerable to the illiberal states with whom we must cooperate in order to maintain some semblance of international order, then I think we do need to back away from these types of norms like R2P. And what I think we can do instead is really reinforce the idea of sovereignty and self-determination on the part of individual states. And that cuts multiple ways, right? Because even as it means that the United States is not necessarily going to do armed regime change at the tip of a spear or forcible human rights promotion, again, by military means in other states, it also means that I think we're on firmer ground in saying to Russia, to China, that they cannot go and impinge upon the sovereignty of other states within what they might like to call their spheres of influence. So I think it's actually much more to the United States' advantage as we seek to kind of renovate international norms for the 21st century to really draw a line on matters of sovereignty and on matters of forcible third-party intervention into the internal decision-making of states.
Josh?
Just to jump in, because I think Rebecca is 100% correct on this one. And I think it's worth pointing out that R2P is dead on arrival for two different dynamics in great power politics, right? The first one is that Russia and China are understandably concerned with R2P coming in for their own domestic situations. But it's also worth remembering that the U.S. now has an incentive not to push R2P. After all, if you carry R2P to its logical conclusion, this is how you get Russian justification for Crimea and beyond. So this is if we're going to play the game of humanitarian intervention by third parties because of responsibility to protect, this can lead to very weird international interventions where different great powers are just using the norm to justify behaviors that can be very provocative to each side. So I think all the major players in the world stage right now have an incentive to tamp down the R2P norm.
It's worth pointing out that, in the R2P doctrine, such as it exists, the idea is not that a country unilaterally claims the right to do this. It's the Security Council in the Libya model. Now, it was not written into that resolution, though. In the U.S. claimed the underlying doctrine as the predicate for intervention. But the idea is that the Security Council will come together and invoke the responsibility to protect rather than any country in the world on its own declares a responsibility to protect as the predicate for which it would intervene. The other interesting thing about R2P, which without taking a position about whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, I think in the great power competition world and in the light of the sort of know thy adversary aspect of all of this, there is a view among some we always think of ourselves as the established power and the Russian and Chinese as being revisionist powers, but we have been pushing revisions to the international order which the Russians and Chinese don't like for the reasons that were just stated. And so it is not actually completely accurate that we just want the crystallized stasis, liberal international order as was founded in the late 1940s that will sort of endure forever. We want our own changes to these things, some of which they like and some of which they don't like. And so it's a more complicated situation. R2P is a perfect example of where we have essentially tried to push off and on a change to what we would describe as a liberal international order that these guys say, wait, that's revisionist. You're undermining the sovereignty norm, among other things. Other questions? Lauren.
So if we have a new presidential administration come in a couple of years or longer than a couple of years, what sort of conversation would you want the president or president-elect to have with his closest national security advisors at the very beginning to think through about what role the military or use of force plays in an American strategy? And I mean that in a very practical perspective, because they're not going to have the same kind of conversations that you guys are. More in the weeds, how do they think through the very beginning? What is the role of the military or intervention, and how we're going to execute the various levers of power in our administration?
Hold those thoughts. I'm going to take a couple more questions, and this will be our sort of final round before we go to break. So, Steve, Rick.
So, there's the United States has tried to build a model in between, pre-Westphalia and post-Westphalia, where it's either you completely respect sovereignty and anything you do is meddling in a country's norms, which is by getting everybody to agree to use their sovereignty, to sign up to international agreements that say we won't do this stuff, or if we do this stuff, we agree that parties have an obligation to act. We have an obligation to act under the Genocide Convention, and other parties have signed that treaty. So just in practical terms, is it your view that we should not have intervened to stop the killing in Benghazi? We had the military ability to do it. We stopped what might have been a 600,000 or so person mini genocide. Was it your view that we should or should not have tried to stop the genocide in Rwanda?
Okay, great. Saw a couple more hands. Let's do maybe two more questions. Yes, ma'am, and then we'll go back there, and then we'll come to the group.
Catherine Elgin, Princeton University. We started this conversation talking about risks and choice in interventions. And I'm curious how you would draw the lines where an intervention becomes one of choice versus one of necessity. Is that a legal commitment to our allies, or is that some sort of line that we're drawing, and how would we attempt to draw that line? And that goes back to the first question here.
Okay. And yes, ma'am.
Hi, Ashley at National Security Action. I'm curious how you all think that these conversations and lessons apply to the current discussion in Venezuela, whether that's something you see outside of the realm of this grand strategy and something more about the administration specifically, a blip like you were saying. Thanks.
Great. So just to recap, we've got, what would you say to the numerous presidential candidates? Benghazi, Rwanda interventions, do them better than they were done, or don't do them at all. Wars of choice versus wars of necessity. Is it really necessity ever? You could always surrender. Isn't that a choice? And Venezuela. So why don't we, let's just run the table, so to speak, and we'll start with Josh and work our way down here, and then we'll go to our break. So Josh.
So what is the role of the U.S. military? Fundamentally, the tool of last resort, and even a more fundamentally tool of last resort than has been understood. I think we've had a couple of different speakers comment that in the post-Cold War world, the U.S. has resorted to military force as kind of the tool of first resort because it was cheap, right? The U.S. is the only superpower around. I think we need to start thinking very carefully about fundamentally building out other tools of statecraft and coming to the military last, and perhaps not at all. So highly reluctant to intervene with military power, point number one. I'm going to punt on the Libya and Benghazi ones. I think the Rwanda and Benghazi ones, I think I answered that in response to some of the earlier questions. I would just say that it's either a genocide or it's out. There's no such thing as a mini genocide, I don't think. Wars of choices versus wars of necessity, what does the U.S. choose to do? I think Richard's point that these are all wars of choice is spot on. I don't even think look, NATO Article 5 doesn't actually oblige the U.S. to go to war. It says, render all assistance deemed necessary. These are going to be questions about what is in the national interest at a given point in time. And I'm inclined to say, and I've written this, so I'm not saying anything new here, I'm on record already saying this, many of the NATO allies that the U.S. has are not vital to the U.S. national interest. So I'll leave it at that. And what was the last question? I'm sorry.
Venezuela.
Venezuela, I don't have an answer on Venezuela. I'm barely functional these days. It's a terrible situation. I just think, I think at the end of the day, this is a situation that's going to resolve poorly for all parties.
Vance.
What would I say to the presidential candidates? Well, unlike Josh, reading diplomatic history wasn't a youthful indiscretion for me. It's something actually I took seriously. So, a couple of...
No, that's okay. I've written a couple of books. It's fine.
It's all right.
And here I thought we wouldn't have enough disagreement and less robust enough discussion.
So, what I'd say is there are no military solutions. Right? And any foreign policy which is predicated on the idea of imposing a military solution is bound to fail. What I would also say, though, is that there are no purely diplomatic or political solutions either. And that particularly in a moment of renewed great power competition, but even prior to that, as we look back, where we tend to get into trouble, I think, as a country, is we tend to think in binary terms. And our policies tend to fall apart when we think, okay, we're going to pursue diplomacy, the military is a last resort, it's over here, or alternatively, we're using the military power, and the job for the diplomats in the State Department is after they win. Actually, I think when you look at what have been our most successful moments in Grand Strategy, it's precisely when we've been able to integrate and layer military and diplomatic efforts on the strategic level, but also on the operational tactical level. If you look at, for instance, go back to the 1970s, what we did around 1973 in the Yom Kippur War, when we had an ally that was in a fight with a group of states that were backed by our great power competitor. What did the Nixon administration do? It actually very effectively combined incredibly tough-minded, ruthless diplomacy, but also with military movements and maneuvers and measures that ultimately were designed to break the Soviet will to escalate. And they succeeded. It was not at all a risk-averse strategy. It was actually a risk-embracing strategy. It's not the rigid model for success, but it's emblematic of the larger point that I guess I'm trying to make, which is that when you try to think in these things as separate, I think that's often where we end up in trouble. On the question of Rwanda, I look back in hindsight and I do take seriously the idea that there are things that we could have done short of sending the 101st Airborne. With respect to Libya, I was working on Capitol Hill at the time, and I am deeply sobered by how poorly our involvement there went. So while I can't bring myself to say that it would have been right for us just to let those people in Benghazi get slaughtered, the starting point of my discussion would be the many, many, many mistakes that I think that we did make afterwards, and still cognizant of the fact that we might have done everything differently, and it still would be the colossal mess that it is today. And that can be a longer conversation about why things played out the way that they did in Libya. On Venezuela, I guess one of the things which I guess I'm also struck by, and this goes back to the conversations with presidential candidates, we seem to have a pattern of, every inbound president basically says, you see what my foreign policy is going to be? It's going to be the last guys with a minus sign in front of it. And then nonetheless, we seem to see the repetition of certain mistakes or misjudgments. One of them is the notion that, gosh, I think we can really get along with the Russians. This whole thing's a misunderstanding because the previous guy just wasn't able to sit down and have a decent conversation. Another what has been that you see, you look at the parallels, I think, in some respects between Syria and Venezuela. In both cases, a really horrific regime where there's a mass protest against it. We draw a line and say, okay, we want regime change. Before I think we've really thought through, are we prepared to go all the way? Are we prepared to back it up? And in the course of doing so, also wave a signal for some fairly powerful regional and global friends of that regime to step in. I'm personally not in favor of any kind of military intervention in Venezuela. I think that the more interesting case study for Venezuela is how did we end up where we are right now, which I think is a very dangerous position that we find ourselves in. I hope that it will break our way. I hope that the Maduro regime is gone very soon, and that the parallel won't hold. And if that's the case, I'll be the first person to congratulate the Trump administration for its success. And more importantly, they'll just be delighted for the Venezuelan people. But I am more concerned that we're finding ourselves in a situation we've been in before.
So Vance just hinted at this, but the political value of opposing military interventions is clear, and it's bipartisan, right? Every single post-Cold War president has been elected saying that they are going to minimize American military interventions, right, and military posture overseas. Bill Clinton promised a laser focus on the economy. George Bush came into office saying that, he wasn't going to do nation building. The job of the U.S. military wasn't to walk school children to school in the Balkans, right? Barack Obama said it's time for nation building at home. Donald Trump said this has all been a catastrophic mess and I'm going to, rectify it. So the fact that there's political value to attacking these military interventions and the United States' myriad indiscretions in this regard is obvious, right? And yet, the record of each of those presidencies shows that there's a lot about military interventions that become inevitable and exigent in the context of just the unfolding of world events and the domestic politics that surround them here at home. And so I think recognizing the duality of that, both the political value and the strategic merit of saying we've done too much and often in stupid ways, but also recognizing the likelihood that we're going to do it again in some form. It's kind of the paradox at the heart of any discussion you would want to have with an incoming administration. So recognizing the latter piece of that, I guess I would propose that there's sort of three analytical steps, and I'll use them to kind of answer the other questions as well. So first is the question of interests, right? I think any new presidential administration needs to come in with a sharply defined notion of what constitutes the national interest. And I don't think that can be, universally spreading liberalism anywhere that we can, right? I think it needs to sort of look in a much more clear-eyed way at the strategic environment in which we find ourselves now and the limits that it imposes, despite the opportunities that it also offers, and use that as a basically heuristic device for saying, here's what the U.S. really does set out to achieve in the world. And that's how we distinguish wars of necessity from wars of choice, right? Wars of necessity are those that do advance our vital national interests, and wars of choice are the ones that are far more discretionary, that maybe only orthogonally address our national interests. And the problem with, liberal universalism or R2P is that it sets no natural limits on how we define American interests. It defines them basically as being unlimited. So that's the first piece, is to try to have a sober discussion about what the national interest actually is. And then second, and this is related to defining interests but also has to be situationally specific, is to think about which of those interests, and in context which of those interests, can only be defended through military force. Because I think that there's this fallacy that if we don't intervene militarily, we're not doing anything at all. But that's, of course, not true. We can both say that a military intervention in Venezuela is a bad idea, and also say the U.S. should be strongly engaged in trying to bring about the end of the Maduro government in Venezuela, right? Those two things are completely compatible. And so by highlighting and also empowering and funding the other tools of American national power, we can empower ourselves to be proactive in the world and to intervene, but not to intervene militarily. So we should only be thinking about military intervention in those cases where other tools are unavailable or they fail. And then third is in those cases where we do have vital interests, where military force is the best way to advance those interests, then we need to do it in a smart way. And of course, easier said than done. But this was Vance's point a minute ago. We need to get better at sort of defining what our immediate war aims are. We need to do better at defining the strategy for achieving them and avoiding mission creep. We need to do better at thinking about how wars end before they start, so that we have an exit strategy or a war termination strategy baked in. And then insofar as it's possible, we need to try to limit the costs of any wars we do fight on the United States, for example, by burden sharing with allies. and if possible, by working through international institutions that confer additional support, legitimacy, reduce friction. Unfortunately, I think, to Richard's point about R2P, working through the Security Council in the future is likely only to get harder. We've already seen a real spike in vetoes by Russia, China together. And I think we can expect to get much less done through at least sort of international institutions with universal membership over the next decade plus than we have in the past. So I don't think we want to put too much stock in those, even as they do remain the avenue of first resort. So taking all of that together, I think that's how really incoming presidents should be thinking about this. And that has political repercussions, but I think it also has important implications for our defense strategy and the way in which, even as we hope not to engage in future military interventions, we also need to be prepared to do them effectively and intelligently in those cases where necessity dictates.
And how high is your confidence that the incoming president will think about things in the way that you just laid out, systematically and in a logical framework that balances cost with interest and possibility of achievement, factors in expectations and the probability of various outcomes?
Well, the fact that you use the word incoming gives me more hope than the status
Incoming
quo.
or Freudian slip. Okay, on that great note, we are going to take a 10-minute break. For those who want to join afterwards at 11:15-ish, Ryan Evans, editor of War on the Rocks, is going to host a live War on the Rocks podcast on Grand Strategy right here with some of our panelists. Everyone feel free to stay if you would like to stay for that. If you if you do not, thank you for coming, and thank you especially to the panelists that we've had up here in this session and the last. Thanks very much.
Thank you.